A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. Alright, we are diving into the world of retirement math today, which sounds like it could be a dry topic, but it is actually the story of a massive, accidental shift in how millions of people survive their later years. Daniel sent us this one, and he's asking a great question. What exactly is the US savings vehicle called the 401k, and how does it compare to pensions and savings schemes in other countries like the UK, Australia, or Canada? It is a huge topic because it touches on everything from tax code quirks to the fundamental shift of risk from big corporations onto the shoulders of individual workers.
It is a fascinating bit of history too, Corn. Most people think the 401k was this carefully designed master plan by the government to replace pensions, but it was almost a total accident. By the way, before we get into the weeds of the Internal Revenue Code, I should mention that today's episode is powered by Google Gemini 3 Flash. It is helping us pull all these global threads together. But yeah, the 401k. It is basically the bedrock of the American retirement system now, but it started as a loophole.
A loophole that turned into a trillion-dollar industry. I love it. So, let's start with the basics for the folks who might be living in one of those other countries Daniel mentioned. In the US, a 401k is what we call a defined contribution plan. You, the employee, decide to put a slice of your paycheck into an investment account before the taxman gets his hands on it. Your employer usually chips in some money too, which we call the match, and then you just hope the stock market behaves itself for the next 30 or 40 years.
That is the core of it. And the contrast you have to understand is the old school pension, which we call a defined benefit plan. In a pension, the employer promises you a specific check every month for the rest of your life once you retire. The company takes the risk. If the investments they made with the pension fund go south, the company still owes you that check. They have to find the money. With a 401k, if the market drops 20% the year you want to retire, that is your problem, not the company's. It is a massive shift in who carries the bucket.
It is the ultimate you are on your own policy, wrapped in a tax advantage. I was looking at the 2026 numbers, and for anyone under 50, you can shove up to $23,000 into these accounts this year. If you are over 50, you get that catch-up contribution, which brings it to $30,500. That is a lot of tax-deferred room. But, Herman, let's talk about that accidental part you mentioned. How did we get here? Because I do not think most people realize this was not the plan.
It really wasn't. There was a benefits consultant named Ted Benna back in 1980. He was looking at the 1978 Revenue Act, specifically Section 401, Paragraph K. It was originally just meant as a way for companies to give out year-end bonuses in a tax-advantaged way. Benna realized, wait a second, this language is broad enough that we could let employees contribute their regular salary here. He pitched it to a client. They thought it was too risky and said no. So he implemented it at his own company, the Johnson Companies, in 1981. Within a decade, big corporations realized this was a godsend for their balance sheets. They could stop offering those expensive lifelong pensions and just give people a 401k match instead.
It is funny how innovation in the corporate world usually means finding a way to stop paying for things in the long run. But from a worker's perspective, the 401k match is usually described as free money. If I put in 5% of my salary and the company matches that 5%, I have doubled my money before I even pick a single stock. That is a hard deal to turn down, even if I am taking on the investment risk.
It is a powerful psychological hook, but we have to look at the mechanics of that match because it is not always as free as it looks. You have to talk about vesting. Most 401k plans have a vesting schedule. You might put your money in on day one, and that is always yours. But the company's match? You might have to stay at that job for 3, 4, or even 5 years before you actually own that money. If you leave after 2 years, they take their match back. In a world where people change jobs every 3 years, a lot of that free money never actually ends up in the employee's pocket.
Which is a huge contrast to some of the international systems, right? Like Australia. I was reading about their superannuation system, or super as they call it. That seems way more aggressive than the American model.
Australia is probably the gold standard for defined contribution systems right now. In 2026, the superannuation guarantee requires employers to contribute 11.5% of an employee's earnings into their retirement fund. And here is the kicker, it is mandatory and it is usually vested immediately. You do not have to opt in like you do with a 401k in many US companies. It is just part of the cost of doing business in Australia. It has created this massive pool of capital that makes Australia's retirement system one of the most sustainable in the world.
11.5% is massive. In the US, a good match is maybe 4 or 5%. And that is only if you contribute your own money first. The Australian model says, we do not care if you save. The employer is putting this in regardless. It solves the behavioral problem of people just being lazy or overwhelmed by the choices. Because, let's be honest, picking between 20 different mutual funds and a 401k is enough to make most people just close the browser and go watch Netflix.
That is exactly what happens. We call it choice paralysis. And the US has tried to fix this with something called target date funds, or TDFs. These are the set it and forget it options. You pick the year you want to retire, say 2055, and the fund automatically shifts from risky stocks to safer bonds as you get closer to that date. But even that is changing. In 2026, we are seeing this trend of black box target date funds where the algorithms are becoming much more proprietary and opaque. It is supposed to be customized, but it makes it harder for the average person to see what they are actually paying in fees.
Fees are the silent killer. A 1% fee sounds small, but over 30 years, that can eat up a third of your total nest egg. It is wild. But okay, if we look at the UK, they have a different flavor too. They have this auto-enrollment thing where the employer has to put you in a pension, unless you actively say no, I want to be poor later.
The UK system is interesting because they have the SIP, the self-invested personal pension, which is more like an IRA in the US where you have total control. But for the average worker, the workplace pension is the key. They have a minimum contribution level, and like you said, the auto-enrollment has been a huge success. It pushed participation rates through the roof. Before that, you had the same problem as the US. A lot of people just didn't sign up because they didn't understand it or didn't want to see their take-home pay drop by £50.
It is all about the nudge. If you make the default saving for retirement, people save. If you make the default doing nothing, people do nothing. It is a simple psychological trick that the US is finally starting to adopt with the Secure 2.0 Act. By 2026, more companies are being pushed to do auto-enrollment here. But the US still has this weird split between the traditional 401k and the Roth 401k. And that is where the real tax gambling happens.
That is a great way to put it. It is a gamble on your future self versus the current government. With the traditional 401k, you get the tax break today. You do not pay taxes on that money now, but you pay ordinary income tax when you take it out in 30 years. With a Roth, you pay the tax now, but everything it earns is tax-free forever. The gamble is whether you think tax rates will be higher or lower when you retire. And given the 2026 Social Security Trustees Report, which shows the trust funds could be depleted by 2034, there is a lot of pressure on the government to find revenue. Many people are looking at the sunset of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act provisions and thinking, maybe I should pay my taxes now while I know what the rate is.
I've always found the Roth versus traditional debate funny, because it assumes we can predict what a politician in 2050 is going to do. Good luck with that. But the traditional 401k has this other hidden trap, required minimum distributions. The government eventually says, okay, we have waited long enough for our cut. You have to start taking this money out and paying us. If you have a huge 401k, those mandatory withdrawals can actually push you into a higher tax bracket and make your Social Security benefits taxable. It is a complicated web.
It really is. And that brings us to the longevity risk that Daniel's notes mentioned. This is the part that actually keeps people up at night. In the old pension world, the company had to worry about you living to be 110. In the 401k world, that is your problem. If you withdraw 4% a year and the market has a bad decade, or you just happen to have great genes and live a long time, you might run out of money. That is why in 2026, we are seeing more 401k plans offering annuity options. It is basically a way to use your 401k to buy a mini pension for yourself.
So we are basically reinventing the pension, but using our own saved money to do it instead of the company's money. It is a full circle. But let's talk about Canada for a second. They have the RRSP, which sounds like something you'd find in a hospital, but it is their version of this. How does that compare?
The Registered Retirement Savings Plan in Canada is actually more like a US IRA than a 401k. It is an individual account. But Canada also has the CPP, the Canada Pension Plan, which they have been enhancing recently. It is a mandatory state-run pension that is much more robust than the US Social Security system. So a Canadian worker has this three-legged stool, the government pension, the employer-sponsored plans if they have them, and their own RRSP. It is a bit more balanced in terms of where the risk sits.
It feels like the US is the outlier in how much it relies on the individual to be a professional investment manager. I mean, think about the average person. They are busy, they have kids, they have jobs. Expecting them to understand the difference between an S&P 500 index fund and a managed growth fund, while also calculating their tax liability 30 years out, it is a lot of cognitive load.
It is a massive cognitive load, and it leads to the savings gap. In the US, only about 58% of eligible workers actually participate in their 401k plans. In Australia, it is over 90% because of that mandatory enrollment. This is where the inequality really starts to bake in. If you work for a big tech company or a law firm, you get a great 401k with a high match and low fee funds. If you are in the gig economy or working for a small business, you might have nothing. You are relying entirely on Social Security, which, as we noted, is facing some serious headwinds.
Speaking of the gig economy, that is a huge hole in the 401k model. If you are an independent contractor, you do not have an employer to set this up for you. You have to do a solo 401k or a SEP IRA, which are great, but again, it requires you to be the one driving the bus. There is no free money match from a boss when you are the boss. You are just moving money from one pocket to the other.
And even for those who do have a 401k, there is the issue of leakage. This is a big problem in the US. When people change jobs, they often just cash out their 401k instead of rolling it over into an IRA or their new employer's plan. They pay a 10% penalty and ordinary income tax. It feels like a windfall in the moment, but it destroys the compounding interest that makes these plans work. In many other countries, it is much harder to touch that money before retirement age. The US system is very leaky, by design because we value liquidity, but that liquidity comes at a high price for your 80-year-old self.
It is the classic present self versus future self battle. Present self wants a new car or needs to pay off a credit card. Future self wants to not eat cat food in a basement. Present self usually wins that fight if the money is accessible. But Herman, what about the father of the 401k himself? You mentioned Ted Bennett calls it a monster now. Why?
Bennett is very vocal about this. He thinks the system has become way too complex and that the financial services industry has basically hijacked it to suck out fees. He argues that most people would be better off with a simple, low-cost, Wall Street free option. He is also worried about the shift in risk. He never intended for the 401k to be the only thing people have. He saw it as a supplement to a pension. When the pensions disappeared, the 401k was forced to do a job it wasn't designed for. It is like trying to use a screwdriver to hammer in a nail. It works, but it is messy and you might break something.
I like that. It is a screwdriver being used as a hammer. So if we look at the global rankings, where does the US actually land? Daniel mentioned the Mercer CFA Institute Global Pension Index.
In the 2025 and 2026 rankings, the US usually sits around number 22 or 23. We get high marks for our capital markets and the depth of our investment options, but we fail on sustainability and adequacy. Countries like the Netherlands, Iceland, and Denmark consistently take the top spots. They have systems that combine a strong state pension with mandatory industry-wide private pensions. It is a much more collective approach. The US system is very efficient at generating wealth for those who can afford to play, but it leaves a lot of people behind.
It is a very American approach. High ceiling, low floor. If you are savvy and you have a high income, you can build a massive fortune in a 401k and a Roth IRA. But if you are struggling to make ends meet, the tax advantage doesn't mean much because you do not have any extra money to defer in the first place.
That is the crux of the wealth inequality issue. The tax benefits of a 401k go primarily to people in high tax brackets. If you are in the 12% bracket, your tax break for contributing is pretty small. If you are in the 37% bracket, the government is essentially subsidizing 37 cents of every dollar you save. It is a regressive way to encourage savings.
So let's get into some practicalities for 2026. If someone is listening to this and they are looking at their 401k portal, what should they actually be doing? Because there are some new rules this year, right?
The biggest thing is checking your match and your vesting. If your company offers a match, that should be your absolute priority. It is a 100% return. Even if you hate the investment options, you take the match. In 2026, under Secure 2.0, more employers are also allowed to match your student loan payments with contributions to your 401k. That is a huge win for younger workers who feel like they can't save because they are drowning in debt. You pay your loan, the company puts money in your retirement. Check if your HR department offers that.
That is an incredible feature. It finally acknowledges that your balance sheet is one big system, not just a bunch of isolated buckets. What about the catch-up contributions? You mentioned those for the over 50s.
Yeah, and there is a new twist there too. For high earners, those catch-up contributions now have to go into a Roth account. The government wants their tax money now rather than later. So, if you are over 50 and making over a certain threshold, you do not get the immediate tax break on those extra thousands of dollars. It is another sign that the government is trying to pull tax revenue forward to deal with the budget deficits we are seeing in 2026.
They are definitely getting creative with how they get their cut. I also want to talk about the target date fund trap. You mentioned them being black boxes now. Should people be wary of the default option?
Not necessarily wary, but you should be aware. Look at the expense ratio. If your target date fund is charging you 0.5% or higher, you are probably overpaying. Many of these funds just wrap together other funds and add a fee on top. You might be able to recreate the same thing with 3 simple index funds: total stock market, international stock, and a bond fund for a fraction of the cost. It takes 10 minutes of work once a year to rebalance it yourself.
10 minutes of work to save $100,000 over a career? That is a pretty good hourly rate. Even a sloth like me can handle 10 minutes once a year. But what about the annuity thing you mentioned? Is that a good move for people nearing retirement in 2026?
It depends on your risk tolerance. If you are terrified of outliving your money, buying a guaranteed income product inside your 401k can provide peace of mind, but you have to be careful. Annuities are notorious for having high commissions and complex surrender charges if you want to change your mind later. The 2026 rules have made it easier for 401k providers to offer these, which is good for access, but you really have to read the fine print. It is basically the financial version of buying insurance against living too long.
Insurance against living too long. Only in the world of finance could a long, healthy life be considered a risk you need to insure against. It is wild. But okay, if we zoom out to the global perspective again, do you think the US will ever move towards something like the Australian model? A mandatory universal system?
There is a big debate about that right now in 2026. We are seeing some states like California and Oregon create their own mandatory auto IRA programs for workers whose employers do not offer a plan. It is a public option for retirement. There is a lot of pushback from people who don't want the government or employers telling them how to spend their money, but the data from Australia is hard to ignore. They have almost no retirement poverty compared to the US. It is a trade-off between individual freedom and collective security.
And we know which way the US usually leans on that one. But the Atzmai experience in Israel that we've talked about before is another interesting angle, where freelancers are actually required by law to contribute to a pension. It is a forced savings mechanism that feels annoying when you are paying it, but you are probably going to be pretty happy about it when you are 75.
It is the ultimate nudge, and that is really the takeaway here. The 401k is a powerful tool, but it is a tool that requires a lot of maintenance. If you are in the US, you are essentially the CEO of your own one-person pension fund. You have to handle the contributions, the investment strategy, the tax planning, and the withdrawal rate. In a place like the UK or Australia, a lot of that is automated or managed at a higher level.
It makes me think about the match psychology Daniel mentioned. We see that match as a bonus, but really, it is just a part of our total compensation that the company has successfully offloaded. In the pension days, your compensation included a guaranteed check for life. Now, your compensation includes the opportunity to save your own money and maybe get a little extra if you do. The total value of the retirement benefit has actually dropped significantly for most workers, even if their 401k balance looks big.
That is a brilliant point. We are doing more of the work for a benefit that is ultimately less certain. It is a productivity gain for the corporation, but a risk gain for the worker. And when you factor in that many people don't even participate, the average retirement security has definitely declined since the peak of the pension era in the 1960s and 70s.
It is the accidental monster indeed. So, if you are sitting there in 2026 and you are thinking about your own monster, what is the one thing you should do today?
I would say check your tax diversification. Most people have all their money in a traditional 401k. If tax rates go up in the 2030s to pay for Social Security or the national debt, you are going to get hit hard. Consider opening a Roth IRA or doing Roth contributions in your 401k if you can. Having a bucket of money that the government can't touch later is a huge hedge against political risk.
Political risk. The one thing no target date fund can solve for. I also think people should look at their health savings accounts, or HSAs, as a secret retirement weapon. If you have a high deductible plan, that money goes in tax-free, grows tax-free, and if you use it for medical expenses in retirement, which, let's face it, we all will, it comes out tax-free. It is like a super Roth.
It is the only triple tax advantaged account in the US system. It is actually more powerful than a 401k in many ways. If you can afford to pay your current medical bills out of pocket and let that HSA money grow, it is a massive boost to your retirement security. Again, it is another choice the US system gives you that requires you to be a bit of a financial nerd to maximize.
Which is why we are here, Herman, to be the nerds so our listeners don't have to be. Although, let's be honest, you are the head nerd. I am just here for the cheeky observations and to make sure we don't spend 40 minutes talking about actuarial tables.
I could talk about actuarial tables for hours. Corned, don't tempt me. But I think we've covered the big picture. The 401k is a uniquely American solution to a universal problem. It offers incredible flexibility and wealth-building potential, but it demands a level of financial literacy that we don't necessarily teach in schools. Compared to the rest of the world, we are the DIY nation of retirement.
DIY retirement. That should be the slogan on the IRS website. It has been a journey from a 1980s loophole to a global comparison. I think the big takeaway is that whether you are in a 401k, a super, or a SIP-EP, the risk is shifting toward you. The days of the company taking care of you from cradle to grave are over. You have to be the one looking at the numbers.
And you have to look at them regularly. Don't just set it and forget it, and then wake up at 65 and realize you were in a high-fee fund or you didn't have the right tax mix. The system is designed to reward those who pay attention.
Well, I am paying attention now, mostly because you scared me with that cat food in the basement comment. I am going to go check my vesting schedule as soon as we finish here.
As you should. And maybe check those catch-up contributions too. You aren't getting any younger, Corn.
Ouch. Low blow, Herman. Low blow, but fair. Anyway, I think that is a solid deep dive for today. We have demystified the 401k, looked at why Australia is winning the retirement game, and why a guy named Ted Benna is worried about the monster he created.
It is a lot to unpack, but it is probably the most important math any of us will ever do. Thanks for the prop, Daniel. It is a great reminder that even the most boring parts of our financial lives have these wild histories and global variations.
Definitely. We will have to check back in a few years and see if the annuity in a 401k thing actually takes off, or if people just keep gambling on the S&P 500. My money is on the gambling.
Probably a safe bet.
All right, let's wrap this one up. Big thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flemingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes. And a huge thank you to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the generation of this show. We literally couldn't do this without that serverless horsepower.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you found this breakdown helpful, or if you are now frantically logging into your retirement portal, let us know. You can reach us at show@myweirdprompts.com.
And if you want to make sure you never miss an episode where we explain complicated things with a side of brotherly teasing, find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your audio fix. You can also head over to myweirdprompts.com for the full archive and all the links to subscribe.
See you in the next one.
Later. This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash, text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the flows from sloth, from man, from long-eared host. My Weird Prompts, until next time, stay curious, keep weirding.